The drive from Seattle to Salem for Thanksgiving was usually pretty straightforward. 6 hours of open road, a playlist, and the quiet hum of the highway. But this year, as the miles ticked by, there was a familiar knot tightening in my stomach. I told myself it was just the usual holiday stress, the pressure of family expectations. I tried to push down the feeling that something deeper, more insidious, was waiting for me. My family home always had a peculiar atmosphere, a blend of warm memories and unspoken tension. My sister, Stephanie, had a way of dominating the space even before she arrived. This trip, she'd already settled in 2 days prior with her husband, Kevin, and their 3 kids, effortlessly positioning herself as the celebrated daughter. Our mother, Diane, only fueled it, fawning over Stephanie, praising every small act as if it were a monumental achievement. By the time I walked through the door on Wednesday evening, the pecking order was firmly re-established. I was Eleanor Vance, and I usually got the brains, the scholarships, the career that actually felt meaningful, but Stephanie, at 35, held the charisma, the charm, the looks. This unsaid comparison had carved a canyon between us that grew wider with each year. The first real crack appeared at dinner on Thursday. I'd made the mistake of mentioning my recent promotion to senior architect. The table fell silent. Stephanie's smile became a brittle mask. Diane immediately changed the subject, launching into a long story about Stephanie volunteering at her kids' school fundraiser. My father, Arthur, tried to congratulate me, but Diane spoke over him, her voice rising, deliberately drowning out his words. It was a familiar pattern, but it still stung. The next morning, Stephanie cornered me in the hallway outside my old bedroom. Her eyes were unsettling, too calm. She suggested we head to the basement. Diane apparently wanted to organize some old photo albums. I hesitated, an instinct screaming at me, but Arthur was nearby, catching snippets of the conversation, and he encouraged me. "Spend some time with your sister," he urged, genuinely believing we could mend things. His optimism had always been his undoing. Our childhood basement was never a proper living space. Bare concrete walls, exposed insulation, and a section in the back with a dirt floor where the foundation was unstable. In November, with temperatures already dipping below freezing at night, it was a tomb. We never heated it. It was just for storage, Christmas decorations, forgotten furniture. Stephanie chattered about her youngest daughter's ballet recital as she led the way down the creaky wooden stairs. I followed, completely unsuspecting. She pointed to a box of photos near the old furnace, and I bent down, letting memories wash over me, birthdays, summer trips, school plays. For a brief moment, I actually thought this might be a genuine attempt at connection. Then, the door slammed. The distinct click of a lock followed. I spun around, rushing up the stairs, but the heavy wooden door wouldn't budge. Stephanie had installed a deadbolt on the outside, something I hadn't noticed on the way down. I started yelling, throwing my shoulder against the wood, but it was useless. I heard my sister's footsteps retreating across the floor above. She was humming. For the first hour, I convinced myself someone would notice. Arthur would wonder where I'd gone. Diane would need something from down there. Someone would come. By the second hour, the cold began to seep through my jeans and sweater. The temperature gauge on the wall read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't nearly enough. By hour 4, my throat was raw, my voice gone from screaming. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. the thick concrete walls acting like a shield. I curled up against the furnace, which offered only a phantom warmth to the upper floors. My teeth wouldn't stop chattering. Hour 7 brought the serious shaking. My body convulsed, trying desperately to generate heat that simply wasn't there. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around myself, feeling every last bit of warmth leaching into the concrete. My mind kept drifting to thoughts of hypothermia, how people could succumb to exposure. Would they even find me down here? Would anyone care? Around hour 10, confusion set in. My thoughts became foggy, disconnected. Childhood memories mixed with the terrifying present, creating bizarre, fleeting images. I thought I saw my grandmother, gone for 15 years, sitting in the corner, gently telling me to rest, to just close my eyes. "Everything will be better when you wake up, sweetheart," she whispered. By hour 14, I'd given up. No one was coming. Stephanie had done this deliberately, and Diane either hadn't noticed or simply didn't care that I'd vanished. I thought about my life in Seattle, my apartment overlooking the river, my cat, Chloe, who would be wondering where I was. My assistant, Chloe, would worry when I didn't show up on Monday. But Monday was 3 days away. The trembling stopped around hour 16. My body had surrendered. I felt strangely peaceful, detached. The cold didn't hurt anymore. I was just tired, so incredibly tired. Sleep seemed like the only reasonable option. I let my eyes drift closed. The sound of the door opening snapped me partially back to consciousness. Arthur's voice, panicked and broken, calling my name. Hands lifting me, carrying me up the stairs. Bright lights that hurt my eyes. Sirens wailing in the distance. Someone wrapped me in blankets that felt like sandpaper against my frozen skin. I woke up in Salem Memorial Hospital. The room was aggressively warm. Heat lamps surrounded my bed, and clear fluid dripped into my arm. A woman in a white coat, Dr. Emily Miller, stood at the foot of my bed, her face etched with deep concern. She noticed me stirring and moved closer, her expression professional but kind, the face of someone who had witnessed profound suffering but hadn't let it harden her completely. She checked my vitals, explained what had happened: severe hypothermia, my core temperature a dangerously low 89 degrees when paramedics arrived. Another hour, maybe 2, she said, and I wouldn't have survived. Then she asked the question that changed everything: how did you end up locked in that basement? I told her the truth. Every detail, from Stephanie's invitation to the distinct click of the deadbolt, to the hours of screaming that went unanswered. Dr. Miller's face grew darker with each sentence. She excused herself, saying she needed to make some calls. 20 minutes later, Detective Maya Sanchez and Officer David Chen entered my room. They recorded my statement, asking detailed questions. Had there been previous incidents with my sister? Yes, I admitted. Years of subtle cruelty, psychological games, systematic undermining. But nothing like this. Nothing that could have almost ended my life. Detective Sanchez asked about security cameras. Arthur had installed a system 2 years earlier after a neighborhood break-in. There were cameras covering most of the first floor, including one in the kitchen with a clear view of the basement door. I gave them permission to request the footage from Arthur. He provided it within hours. Arthur came to my hospital room afterward, his face gray with shock and shame. He'd watched the recording, Stephanie leading me downstairs, returning alone, locking the door. He'd watched Diane ask where I'd gone, heard Stephanie casually say, Eleanor drove back to Seattle early because of a work emergency. He'd seen his family continue their day, eating meals, watching television, tucking the kids into bed, while I was freezing below. Arthur wept. He'd believed Stephanie's lie completely. Never questioned why I would leave without saying goodbye, without my suitcase, without my car that still sat in the driveway. He trusted his eldest daughter, and that trust had nearly caused his youngest's demise. The police arrested Stephanie that evening. She protested dramatically, claiming it was a misunderstanding, a prank gone too far. Her lawyer argued she'd simply forgotten I was down there, distracted by her children. The security footage shattered that defense. It clearly showed her checking the basement door multiple times throughout the day, ensuring the lock held. She'd even smiled once, a small, satisfied expression as she tested the deadbolt. Dr. Miller's testimony was crucial. She explained to the prosecutor exactly how close I'd come to dying, detailing the permanent damage hypothermia can cause. Frostbite had claimed 2 of my toes and parts of 3 fingers. I'd need physical therapy to regain full function in my hands. The psychological trauma, she warned, would take years to process, if it ever fully healed. The severe act of aggression charge came as a shock to everyone except Dr. Miller, who recognized the deliberate nature of Stephanie's actions reflected in my medical condition. Diane hired an expensive defense attorney for Stephanie, draining her retirement savings. She called me at the hospital, her voice shaking with rage, not concern. How could I do this to my sister? Stephanie had 3 children who needed their mother. I was tearing the family apart over an accident. I hung up on her. Arthur showed up an hour later, divorce papers in hand. He'd already filed. After 37 years of marriage, he was done. Watching that security footage had shattered something fundamental in him, revealing a truth he could no longer ignore. Diane had known on some level. She chose not to ask questions, not to investigate. Her favoritism had enabled a profound act of malice. The months between Stephanie's arrest and the trial were a special kind of hell. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from the physical harm. The frostbite was worse than doctors initially realized. My left foot required surgery to remove damaged toes, a procedure that left me unable to walk properly for months. Physical therapy sessions were excruciating, forcing blood flow back into tissue that had partially died from the extreme cold. The nightmares began during my hospital stay. Every night, I'd wake up screaming, convinced I was back in that basement. The nurses gave me sleeping medication, but it only made things worse. I'd fall into deep sleep and experience vivid hallucinations about freezing, about my family standing around my frozen form and discussing what to have for dinner. Dr. Miller recommended a psychiatrist, Dr. Lisa Kim, who specialized in trauma cases. Dr. Kim visited me 3 times a week. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was post-traumatic stress, a normal response to an abnormal situation. Someone I trusted had tried to cause my demise, and my brain was struggling to process that betrayal. She warned me that recovery would take years, not months. Some survivors, she said, never fully heal from this kind of familial cruelty. Arthur visited daily, bringing flowers and books, sitting quietly beside my bed. He aged 10 years in those 6 weeks. The guilt consumed him visibly. He lost weight, developed a nervous habit of rubbing his hands together constantly. He told me stories about my childhood I'd forgotten, moments when he'd noticed Stephanie's cruelty but dismissed it as sibling rivalry. The pattern had been there all along, escalating slowly over decades until it reached an act of profound malice. Diane came once, exactly once, during my entire hospital stay. She stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, her face twisted with resentment rather than concern. She wanted me to drop the charges. Stephanie was suffering in jail, separated from her children, facing public humiliation. Couldn't I see how this was affecting the whole family? The neighbors were talking. Her church friends were asking questions. My stubborn insistence on pressing charges, she claimed, was causing more damage than the actual incident. I stared at her in disbelief. The actual incident, that's what she called 18 hours of deliberate torment that nearly took my life. She couldn't even acknowledge what Stephanie had done. Couldn't use words like a severe act of aggression or cruelty. Everything had to be minimized, sanitized, transformed into something manageable that wouldn't threaten her worldview, where Stephanie was the golden child who could do no wrong. Dr. Miller entered during Diane's visit, took one look at the situation, and ordered my mother to leave. Diane protested indignantly, claiming she had every right to visit her daughter. Dr. Miller's response was ice-cold professional fury. My patient's core temperature was 89 degrees upon admission. Another hour and we'd be having a very different conversation. If you can't support her recovery, you need to leave immediately. Diane left in a huff, and I never saw her in person again. The media attention was overwhelming. Local news picked up the story first, running segments about the Thanksgiving basement attack. Then regional outlets grabbed it, followed by national coverage. My hospital room phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews. Hospital security had to post guards outside my door to prevent journalists from sneaking in. I gave one interview, carefully coordinated with the prosecutor's office. A reporter named Olivia Reed from a major network sat beside my hospital bed and asked gentle questions. I showed her my damaged hands and feet, explained the timeline, described the cold. The segment aired nationally and sparked enormous public interest. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion about family loyalty versus accountability. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Some insisted I was overreacting, that siblings fight, and this was just an argument that escalated. Others recognized the calculated nature of Stephanie's actions and called for maximum sentencing. The comment sections on news articles were vicious battlegrounds where strangers debated whether I deserved sympathy or condemnation for destroying my sister's life. Kevin filed for divorce 3 months after Stephanie's arrest. He released a public statement through his attorney, expressing horror at his wife's actions and full support for my recovery and the prosecution. He'd hired a private investigator to review the evidence, wanting to understand what kind of person he'd been married to for 12 years. The investigator uncovered a disturbing pattern of escalating concerning behavior in Stephanie's past. There had been incidents at her previous jobs I'd never known about, a coworker locked in a supply closet during a workplace dispute, a neighbor whose car brakes had mysteriously failed after a property line argument. Nothing provable, nothing that resulted in charges, but a clear pattern of Stephanie responding to perceived slights with dangerous accidents. Kevin was terrified for his children, wondering what she might have done to them eventually if this hadn't happened. The prosecutor assigned to my case was Brenda Davies, a veteran of domestic violence cases who understood family dynamics better than anyone I'd met. She spent hours with me preparing my testimony, helping me understand what the defense would argue, coaching me on how to remain composed under cross-examination. Brenda had seen dozens of cases where family members committed terrible acts of aggression and then claimed it was accidental or exaggerated. Brenda also helped me understand the civil lawsuit process. Criminal charges would hold Stephanie accountable publicly, but a civil suit could provide financial compensation for my injuries and ongoing medical expenses. She recommended Michael Thorne, an attorney who specialized in personal injury cases involving family cruelty. Michael was aggressive and strategic, exactly what I needed. The preliminary hearings were brutal. Stephanie's defense attorney, Richard Sterling, was expensive and ruthless. He tried to get the charges reduced to reckless endangerment, arguing that Stephanie hadn't intended to cause serious harm. The security footage destroyed that argument, but Richard kept trying different angles. Maybe I'd gone into the basement willingly and locked myself in. Maybe I'd exaggerated my symptoms for attention. Maybe this was an elaborate scheme to frame Stephanie out of jealousy. Each hearing required me to relive the trauma. I'd sit in the courtroom while attorneys argued about whether my sister had really tried to cause my demise or just made a terrible mistake. Diane attended every hearing, sitting behind Stephanie's defense table, shooting me hateful looks. Arthur sat on my side of the courtroom, his face gray and haunted. The trial took 8 months to begin. During that time, I moved my life completely out of Washington. Seattle held too many memories, too much connection to a family I no longer claimed. I accepted a position with an architectural firm in Chicago, 3,000 miles from Salem. Chloe helped me pack, made the cross-country drive with me, and stayed for 2 weeks to help me settle into my new apartment. Stephanie's attorney tried every strategy available. Character witnesses testified about what a wonderful mother she was, how involved in her community, how this was completely out of character. The prosecution countered with my testimony and that of 3 childhood friends who described years of Stephanie's cruelty toward me. One friend, Jessica, broke down on the stand, recounting how Stephanie had pushed me into a frozen pond when I was 12, then told our parents I'd fallen in while showing off. Kevin filed for divorce halfway through the trial. He believed Stephanie's version of events initially, but cross-examination had revealed details even he couldn't rationalize away. The premeditation was undeniable. Stephanie had installed that deadbolt specifically for this purpose. Purchased it 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. Receipts proved it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty of a severe act of aggression. The judge sentenced Stephanie to 12 years in prison, crediting the extensive planning and the particularly cruel nature of leaving me to freeze to my end. Diane collapsed in the courtroom, screaming about injustice. Arthur sat stone-faced in the gallery, his expression unreadable. Kevin was awarded full custody of the children. He moved them to Arizona, cutting off all contact with Diane. He sent me a letter months later apologizing for not seeing who his wife really was, thanking me for potentially saving his kids from whatever she might have done to them eventually. His oldest daughter had started asking questions about why Eleanor never visited anymore. The truth would come out eventually, but Kevin wanted to control that narrative. The children's therapy records became part of the civil case. Kevin's attorney provided them with permission, wanting to demonstrate the full scope of harm Stephanie had caused. The youngest child, only 4 during the incident, had witnessed some of Stephanie's behavior in the days before Thanksgiving. She told her therapist about Mommy being angry at Eleanor, about Mommy saying mean things when Eleanor couldn't hear. The middle child remembered Stephanie installing the deadbolt on the basement door, asking why they needed it. Stephanie had said it was to keep monsters from coming upstairs. Those therapy records gutted me. Stephanie had involved her children in this, made them witnesses to her deteriorating mental state before she acted. They'd sensed something was wrong with their mother but had no framework to understand what. Kevin's decision to seek full custody wasn't just protective, it was essential. Who knows what Stephanie might have done to them in a moment of anger or jealousy. The financial investigation revealed more disturbing details. Stephanie had convinced me to take out a life insurance policy 3 years before the incident, claiming it was smart financial planning. I'd signed the paperwork during a visit to Salem, trusting my sister's advice. What I didn't know was that she'd submitted a separate beneficiary designation form afterward, forging my signature to name herself instead of the charitable organization I'd intended. The insurance company had never sent me confirmation of the beneficiary details, a procedural failure that let Stephanie's deception go undetected. $500,000, with herself positioned to collect upon my demise. Michael Thorne subpoenaed those records and presented them during the civil trial. The jury's reaction was visceral. This wasn't a prank gone wrong or a momentary lapse in judgment. Stephanie had been planning some kind of violence against me for years, setting up financial incentives for my end. The basement incident was just the execution of a long-term plan. Brenda Davies amended the criminal charges to include a severe act of aggression with premeditation, which carried a much longer potential sentence. Diane's reaction to the insurance policy revelation was telling. She didn't express shock or horror that Stephanie had forged my signature and planned my demise years in advance. Instead, she blamed me for being successful enough that Stephanie felt desperate. If I hadn't gotten that promotion, hadn't moved to Seattle, hadn't built a career that made Stephanie feel inadequate, none of this would have happened. My success had provoked Stephanie into extreme actions. Therefore, I was partially responsible for what happened. Arthur filed for divorce the day after the insurance policy came to light. He'd been holding on to hope that maybe Stephanie had just made a terrible, impulsive decision. The evidence of years of planning destroyed that hope. He hired the most aggressive divorce attorney in Salem and fought for every asset. Diane had enabled Stephanie's concerning behavior through decades of favoritism and excuses. She created a monster and then unleashed it on their younger daughter. Arthur wanted nothing more to do with either of them. The divorce proceedings were vicious. Diane tried to claim emotional distress, arguing that Arthur was abandoning her during the worst time of her life. Arthur's attorney countered with evidence that Diane had known about Stephanie's disturbing behavior for years and covered it up. There were emails between Diane and Stephanie's old employers, Diane making excuses for incidents, Diane offering to pay for damages to avoid official reports. She'd been cleaning up Stephanie's messes for decades. During this time, I started receiving anonymous letters at my new apartment in Chicago. Hate-filled screeds blaming me for destroying my family, calling me vindictive and cruel. Handwriting analysis confirmed they were from Diane, who'd somehow obtained my new address. I filed a restraining order against her, too, which only deepened her fury. She told people at her church that I'd become so spiteful that I'd cut off my own mother from contacting me. The restraining order against Diane was harder to enforce than the one against Stephanie. Diane never made direct threats, just sent passive-aggressive cards and letters expressing her disappointment in how I turned out. But the cumulative effect was harassment, and eventually, a judge agreed. No contact with me, no attempts to obtain my contact information, no third-party messages. Diane violated it twice, resulting in fines and a stern warning that further violations would mean jail time. Jessica testified at the trial about the frozen pond incident from our childhood. She'd been there that day, 12 years old, watching in horror as Stephanie pushed me through thin ice into freezing water. Stephanie had stood on the bank laughing while Jessica ran for help. When our parents arrived, Stephanie claimed I'd been showing off, skating too close to the weak ice despite warnings. Diane believed her immediately. Arthur had looked uncertain but didn't contradict his wife. Jessica had carried guilt about that incident for 20 years. She should have told the truth, should have insisted that Stephanie pushed me. But she was a child facing down two adults who clearly wanted to believe their eldest daughter. So, she stayed silent, and Stephanie learned that she could cause me harm with impunity. Jessica wept on the witness stand, apologizing to me across the courtroom. Her testimony established a pattern of Stephanie using cold as a weapon against me, making the basement incident look less like an isolated event and more like an escalation of lifelong cruelty. 2 other childhood friends came forward with similar stories. Ryan remembered Stephanie locking me in a freezer at a friend's house during a birthday party, claiming it was a game of hide-and-seek. I'd been 7 years old, trapped for 20 minutes before another child heard me screaming. Sarah described an incident at a summer camp where Stephanie had taken my winter coat on the last day, forcing me to ride home in the unheated bus in October weather. The pattern was undeniable and chilling. Diane never spoke to me again. She sent one email 6 months after sentencing, blaming me for destroying her family. I was vindictive, she wrote. Cruel. I'd always been jealous of Stephanie's popularity, her beauty, her perfect family. This was my revenge for a lifetime of being second best. I deleted the message without responding. Arthur reached out regularly. We had coffee whenever I visited Washington for work, which wasn't often. He'd sold the house in Salem, moved to a small condo in Seattle. Being in that house haunted him, he said. Every time he walked past the basement door, he heard my screams that he'd ignored because he believed his daughter's lie. The guilt consumed him. I started therapy in Chicago. Dr. Ben Carter specialized in trauma recovery. Our sessions focused on rebuilding trust, processing betrayal, understanding that my family's dysfunction wasn't my fault or responsibility. It took 2 years before I could sleep through the night without nightmares about the cold. 3 years before I could go into basements without panic attacks. The settlement from the civil suit against Stephanie provided some measure of justice. My attorney, Michael Thorne, argued that her actions had caused permanent physical disability and psychological damage. The jury awarded me $2 million, though collecting it proved difficult since Stephanie had no substantial assets. Kevin agreed to a payment plan from the marital estate, wanting to do what he could to make things right. I used some of that money to establish a foundation for victims of familial cruelty. Too many people suffer in silence because society expects families to stay together regardless of toxicity. My foundation, Second Chances Alliance, provides legal assistance, therapy resources, and emergency housing for people escaping dangerous family situations. We've helped over 300 people in 4 years. Dr. Miller became a close friend. She attended the foundation's launch event, gave a speech about recognizing signs of deliberate harm disguised as accidents. Her involvement brought credibility and media attention we couldn't have achieved otherwise. She admitted she'd almost missed the significance of my case initially, almost accepted the family's explanation that I'd wandered into the basement and gotten trapped accidentally. Something about the deadbolt installation nagged at her, though. She pushed for that police investigation despite pressure from hospital administrators worried about offending a prominent local family. 5 years after the trial, I met someone. His name was Mark, and he was a structural engineer I worked with on a major commercial project in Chicago. He knew my history because my story had been covered extensively in national news. Severe act of aggression on Thanksgiving, sister's deadly game. The headlines were sensational, but they brought awareness to how family violence often gets overlooked or minimized. Mark never pressured me to reconcile with Diane or to forgive Stephanie. He understood that some betrayals are unforgivable, that family doesn't automatically deserve access to your life. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony attended by Arthur, Dr. Miller, Chloe, Jessica, and a handful of close friends I'd made in Chicago. The family I'd chosen, not the one I'd been born into. Stephanie was released from prison after serving 9 years with good behavior. I heard about it through Arthur, who'd maintained minimal contact with her for the sake of closure. She'd written him letters from prison, never apologizing, but insisting she'd been misunderstood. The basement incident was a joke gone wrong. She'd meant to let me out after an hour but got distracted. The security footage showing her testing the lock throughout the day? She was checking to make sure I couldn't escape and hurt myself in anger. The delusion was complete. She'd reconstructed the narrative in her mind, making herself the victim of my vindictiveness. Diane reinforced this version, visiting her weekly in prison, assuring her that I'd always been jealous and manipulative. They built an entire mythology around my supposed villain, unable to confront the truth that Stephanie had deliberately tried to cause my demise. I didn't attend the parole hearing. My victim impact statement was read aloud by the prosecutor, detailing how the attack had fundamentally altered my life, stolen my sense of safety, destroyed my family relationships. The parole board approved her release anyway, citing her clean prison record and completed rehabilitation programs. I wasn't surprised. The system often values the appearance of redemption over the reality of harm done. Arthur warned me that Stephanie might try to contact me. She'd made comments in letters about wanting to repair our relationship, to explain what really happened. I filed a restraining order immediately. No contact, direct or indirect. If she came within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace, she'd go back to prison for violating the order. She tested it once. 3 months after release, she showed up at my office building in Chicago. Security recognized her from the photo I provided and called police before she could enter. She spent 48 hours in jail for the violation. The judge extended my restraining order to 10 years and warned her that any further contact would result in serious consequences. Diane called me after that incident. Her first contact in 6 years. She screamed into the phone about how cruel I was being, refusing to let Stephanie apologize. I listened silently for 30 seconds, then said 4 words: "She tried to cause my demise." Diane sputtered, insisted I was exaggerating, claimed Stephanie had explained everything. I hung up and blocked her number. Arthur's health declined rapidly after that. The stress of maintaining relationships with both daughters while they refused to acknowledge each other had worn him down. He suffered a massive heart attack 8 months later, passing before the ambulance arrived. I flew to Washington for the funeral, my first time back in 4 years. Stephanie attended with Diane. They sat in the front row dressed in black, playing the role of grieving family members. I sat in the back with Mark, surrounded by friends Arthur had made in Seattle. During the service, Diane gave a eulogy that painted Arthur as a devoted father who'd loved both his daughters equally. She didn't mention the divorce or the reasons behind it. The burial was worse. Diane insisted that as the eldest daughter, Stephanie should help her scatter some of Arthur's ashes in his favorite fishing spot. I refused to participate in any ceremony that included Stephanie. Arthur's lawyer, Paul Jenkins, pulled me aside afterward. My father had left a will that specifically addressed this situation. His estate was divided equally between his daughters, but Stephanie's portion was placed in an irrevocable trust for her children, inaccessible to her. My portion came with a letter. I read it that night in my hotel room. Arthur's handwriting, shaky from the heart condition that eventually took his life, covered 3 pages. He apologized for not protecting me, for believing Stephanie's lies, for enabling Diane's favoritism. He explained how watching that security footage had destroyed his understanding of his family. He'd spent the last years of his life trying to make sense of how he'd raised a daughter capable of such profound malice. The letter ended with a request. He wanted me to forgive myself for surviving, for pressing charges, for refusing reconciliation. None of this was my fault. Stephanie had made her choices. Diane had made hers. I deserved to live without guilt, to build a life filled with people who genuinely loved me. He was proud of the woman I'd become, despite everything his family had done to break me. I wept for hours. Mark held me, letting me grieve, not just for my father, but for the family I'd never really had. The fantasy of belonging somewhere, of being valued by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. That dream had died in a freezing basement on Thanksgiving weekend, and I've been mourning it ever since. 10 years have passed since that night in the basement. I'm 42 now, living in Chicago with Mark and our daughter, Lily. She's 6 years old, brilliant and kind, everything I hope she'll always be. We've built a life here that's full and rich, surrounded by genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. The foundation has expanded to 12 cities, helping thousands of people escape toxic family situations. Dr. Miller serves on our board of directors, using her medical expertise to train emergency room staff in recognizing signs of familial cruelty. Chloe runs our Chicago office, coordinating legal services for victims who need protection orders or custody arrangements. Stephanie is somewhere in Arizona. Last I heard, she completed parole and moved away from Washington, perhaps recognizing that her reputation there was permanently damaged. Kevin remarried, and his kids are thriving. The oldest daughter, now 19, reached out to me last year through social media. She wanted to know my side of the story, said her father had told her some of it, but she needed to hear it from me. We met for coffee in Nashville, a neutral city where neither of us had history. I showed her the scars on my fingers and toes, the permanent reminders of what her mother did. Told her about the hours of screaming that nobody answered, the cold that nearly ended my life, the realization that my family valued appearances over my survival. She cried, apologized for things that weren't her fault. Asked if we could stay in touch. We've built a relationship slowly, carefully. She's nothing like Stephanie. Thank goodness. She's studying social work, wants to help families in crisis. Lily adores her, calls her cousin Madison. It's a small redemption, this connection across generational trauma. We're both choosing to be different from what we came from. Diane passed away 2 years ago from complications of diabetes. She'd never managed her health properly, and the stress of Stephanie's imprisonment had accelerated her decline. Stephanie called to inform me, her first direct contact since the restraining order expired. Her voice was flat, emotionless. She said, "Mother had always hoped we'd reconcile before she passed." I said that was unfortunate and ended the call. I didn't attend the funeral. Diane made her choices just as clearly as Stephanie did. She chose favoritism over fairness, delusion over truth, enabling over accountability. The consequences of those choices were hers to bear. I'd spent enough years trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it fairly. The basement incident taught me something valuable about survival. Sometimes the people who harm us most are the ones who were supposed to protect us. Sometimes families are toxic systems that require escape rather than repair. Sometimes justice means walking away completely and building something better from nothing. I still think about that night occasionally. The cold, the fear, the crushing realization that nobody was coming to save me. But I also remember Dr. Miller's determination to uncover the truth, Detective Sanchez's refusal to accept the family's lies, Arthur's eventual courage in choosing justice over family loyalty. Those people saved my life in different ways, and I've tried to honor that by living fully and helping others do the same. Lily asks sometimes about her other grandmother, the one we never visit. I tell her the truth in age-appropriate ways. Some people make bad choices that hurt others. We don't have to maintain relationships with people who are dangerous, even if they're family. She seems to understand as much as a 6-year-old can. We're teaching her that she gets to choose who belongs in her life based on how they treat her. The Foundation's latest project is a documentary about family violence survivors. My story is featured alongside dozens of others who've escaped dangerous relatives. We're hoping to change the cultural narrative that insists families must stay together regardless of toxicity. Blood relation doesn't grant unlimited access to harm people. Stephanie sent a letter last month. It arrived at the Foundation's main office, forwarded to me with a warning from our security team. I debated reading it for days before finally opening the envelope. 3 pages of her handwriting detailing how prison changed her, how she found faith, how she finally understood the enormity of what she'd done. She wanted forgiveness, a chance to explain herself, permission to be part of my life again. I burned the letter in our fireplace. Mark asked if I felt better, and I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no lingering pain. Stephanie had become irrelevant to my life. A cautionary tale I shared to help others rather than a wound that still bled. That realization felt like final freedom from the family that tried to destroy me. Dr. Miller says recovery isn't linear. Some days I still struggle with trust, with believing people when they say they care about me. Therapy continues, probably always will. But I've built a life worth living, filled with people who've proven their love through actions rather than words. That's more than I ever had growing up in that house in Salem. Lily will never spend Thanksgiving in a basement wondering if anyone cares enough to look for her. She'll never question whether her family values her survival. That cycle ends with me. The foundation, the documentary, the relationships I built, they're all part of ensuring that what happened to me helps prevent it from happening to others. Sometimes justice is a prison sentence. Sometimes it's walking away and never looking back. Sometimes it's building something beautiful from the ashes of what tried to destroy you. I've done all three, and I'd make the same choices again without hesitation. What does family mean to you when the bonds are broken by such a profound betrayal?